Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. With each day, there are new possibilities. Today, I want to reflect on Brown versus the Board of Education. Also, I want to reflect on another case, Schuette versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. Here we are 60 years after Brown versus the Board of Education. And unfortunately, many of our schools remain segregated. Many of our schools have inadequate resources. Many of them don't have the necessary computer equipment. Many of them don't have the necessary textbooks. Many of them don't have well-trained, experienced teachers in their schools. So many of our students get a second-class education in a first-class country. And that's just a reality. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made in America. And even in integrated schools, our children still experience problems. And that just makes me reflect on the fact of, the whole question of whether or not integration is the answer to our problems. African Americans, even when they are in integrated schools, they are often tracked in lower level courses, while other students are tracked in advanced courses. Our students are also targeted for disciplinary action, more harsh disciplinary action. And that leads to what's been referred to the school to prison pipeline. That's what a lot of our youth experience in these integrated settings. So integration, while it has opened the doors of opportunity, it has not solved the problems that exist in our community. And that just makes me reflect on a statement that Brother Malcolm X said. He talked about how only a fool would allow his enemy to educate his children. And that's what we do every day. We allow our enemy to educate us. And we wonder why we are so miseducated. We wonder why we still hate ourselves all these years after Jim Crow. Why we still hate ourselves despite living in an integrated society. And that was one of the main points that they talked about in that Brown versus the Board of Education decision. They talked about the stigma of segregation. They talked about how it destroys the self-esteem and self-worth that African Americans have, being forced to be segregated. And that is certainly true. When you are told that you can't sit somewhere, that you can't eat somewhere, that you can't go somewhere simply because you're black, of course that instills a sense of self-hatred within you. Of course it does. When you see signs that say for colored only, or signs that say no coloreds, no dogs, and no Jews, when you see those kinds of signs, obviously that destroys the self-esteem. When you have to explain to your children why you can't go to an amusement park, of course that destroys the self-esteem of the children. Of course it does. But also, even after integration, because of all these centuries and decades of indoctrination, we continue to hate ourselves even today. We continue to. And in some ways, that brings me back to the point about Malcolm and about being educated by your enemy. In these integrated settings, we aren't taught about ourselves. We aren't given a knowledge of self. We're not told about the great contributions that we made to human civilization. We're taught that somebody else is the the creator of civilization. We're taught that somebody else is the standard for everything, the standard for beauty, the standard for intelligence, the standard for accomplishment. So even in these integrated settings, we still maintain this stigma. We still maintain this sense of self-hatred because of this continued indoctrination. And this whole idea of integration, it can be a great thing if people recognize and respect and tolerate each other's differences. But it also can be a source of self-hatred if one feels the need to assimilate. If one feels the need that you have to look like you're like the dominant white culture, you feel like you have to have the same hair as the white culture, the same features as the white culture, the same mannerisms as the white culture. As this other YouTuber that I respect pointed out, the brother Knowledge Speaks Truth, you know, he did a video this morning, and that video kind of inspired me to do this video. But anyway, the point is that even in this integrated setting, you know, we still maintain that stigma about being black because we are being educated by our enemy, our oppressor. Now that brings me to the other point about affirmative action. You know, the whole push for affirmative action is the continuation of the promise in the Brown versus the Board of Education. You know, the idea that everyone should be able to have access to quality education. You know, many African Americans were able to obtain a higher education and obtain professional success as a result of affirmative action. So for that reason, I support affirmative action. You know, I defend affirmative action because affirmative action is under attack right now. It's under attack in the courts. And recently, the Supreme Court issued a decision in Schuette versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. And that decision basically paves the way for the end of affirmative action. There, they allowed Michigan to strike down affirmative action by amending their constitution. Now, if African Americans want to fight to protect affirmative action in Michigan, they have to go up against almost insurmountable obstacles in order to do so. That case, Schuette versus the Coalition, that case basically says that the white majority can enact laws that make it more difficult for African Americans to pursue policies that benefit them. Policies such as affirmative action. They basically paved the way for this to happen. So now if we want to have affirmative action in Michigan, we need to get 2/3 of both houses of the Michigan legislature to pass that law in order for it to happen. We would have to get 10% of the voters to sign a petition in order to put the issue on a ballot. And even then, we would have to get the majority of the voters to support it. And in this political climate in which we live, you know, in Michigan, and I don't live in Michigan, I'm originally from Michigan, but in that climate, you know, in that political climate, it's very difficult for that to happen. So what we have in that case is an example for things to come. I would not be surprised if more states try to amend their state constitutions to make it difficult for affirmative action to continue. If they would not amend their constitutions to ban affirmative action. And, you know, by doing so, basically the doors of opportunity are going to be closed to many of our youth. They won't have the opportunity to pursue higher education. They won't have that opportunity. So we just need to wake up and realize what's going on. You know, we need to be engaged politically. We need to participate in these elections. We need to vote every time and be familiar with the positions of the different politicians. Because, you know, the Supreme Court justices were appointed by presidents. That's how they get in their position. So it's very important that each one of us vote every time in every election. You know, the state legislatures are made up of representatives and senators elected by the people. So if you are not voting, you don't have a say. You don't count. So we need to vote in these elections. We need to be aware of the politicians' positions on the issues. Because if we're not, and if we don't, you know, things like what happened in Michigan will continue to happen around this country. Our civil rights will be reversed. You know, our gains will be reversed. Just like Reconstruction. You know, we had, right after Reconstruction, you know, we had black congressmen. Black people were starting to build up businesses, starting to establish themselves. But all of that stuff was ripped apart after Reconstruction. And we have to stand up and make sure that our rights are protected. So we need to remain politically engaged and aware.